Shabbat Shalom, I'm Steve Hunegs. Welcome to the JCRC Living Room webinar series today with Ambassador Dennis Ross. Welcome, Dennis. In April, much of our country celebrates Passover, Easter, and Ramadan, as well as the rest of the world. Blessings to all. We're thankful for the first responders and medical personnel throughout our region, country, and world as they perform their missions of mercy under extraordinarily difficult conditions. We express our thanks for the bipartisan leadership of our governor and lieutenant governor and our speaker, majority leader, and legislators. We're thankful for the bipartisan efforts of the Minnesota and Dakotas federal delegations, including our senators and members of Congress. Thank you to the rabbis of our community and all clergy for the remarkable spiritual and pastoral care you are providing. And thank you to my wonderful JCRC colleagues and our entire community for their support back at Mission Control, Sammy, Anthony, and Ethan. This is part of our JCRC Living Room webinar series, or in my case, dining room series. As you can see, our ketubah in the background. Began yesterday with President of the Federal Reserve District of Minneapolis, Neil Kashkari, in conjunction with Minneapolis Council for Nonprofits. We had about 400 participants yesterday, and I'm pleased to say we have about 200 for Ambassador Dennis Ross. Terrific. A special note for those with particular interest in Israel, May 7 is our webinar with David Horovitz, the founding editor of the Times of Israel, and author and commentary, Sarah Tuttle Singer. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our friend, Ambassador Dennis Ross. The ambassador has served our country at the highest levels, shaping American foreign policy, in general, Middle East policy specifically, across 4 decades. On these profoundly intricate and complicated matters, Dennis has served as a trusted advisor in the most sensitive times to Presidents George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and he was a member of the NSC staff for President Ronald Reagan. In a Dayenu vein, he's an essayist. See his recent commentary piece in the Washington Post about U.S. leadership in COVID-19, and he's the author of many books. His most recent book with David Makovsky is How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. And Dennis will be returning to us, God willing, in the fall to give book talks about his newest book. And of course, Dennis, you're more than welcome to say anything you would like about the book today. Another my favorite of the Dennis Ross series is Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israel relationship from Truman to Obama, with whom I've had the pleasure of discussing with Dennis over the years. Dennis is a counselor, and he's the William Davidson Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. A special thank you to Will Ellison from the Washington Institute for your critical assistance. Will, you made it happen. Dennis has visited Minnesota many times over the years with the JCRC, and we've joined with Global Minnesota, the Humphrey School, the Federations, APAC, and Hillel to host his talks on a variety of topics. Dennis and his wife, Debbie, are also part of my aunt and uncle Heidi and Howard Gilbert's family, which makes them part of our Twin Cities mishpacha. Our format is we're going to hear from Dennis Ross for about 15 minutes or so. Please send your questions. I may ask the first 2 questions, but now let us give a warm virtual Twin Cities welcome to Dennis Ross.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's really good to be with you, even virtually. And I must say, during this time of social distancing, the ability to connect with people through Zoom and other such mechanisms, I think, gives us all a sense of community at a time when we really need it. You know, I'll talk about what's going on in Israel, and also I'll talk about Iran, and we obviously in our discussion can get into any questions you want. I do want to say one thing, only because to start, I'm a member of a synagogue where we have a number of clinicians from the National Institutes of Health. And so in my discussions with them, I've learned a number of things that I'd just like to pass on to you before I get into the areas that I actually know something about. So what I'm about to say is reflecting what their views are, not necessarily what I know. But these are leading people who, among other things, are working on the vaccine and also on the treatment. And I want to draw a distinction between the two. You've heard a lot about when the vaccine can be available. It has to go through tests. Obviously, treatment does as well. Vaccine is something that takes basically at least a year to produce on any kind of mass scale. Not only because it has to go through tests, but also because The sheer production of this is going to take some time. And the clinical tests themselves have to be large enough to create a sense of safety for the vaccine. The treatment is different. The treatment identifies basically the antibody sequence within the virus itself. And that once they've established that sequence, they can go ahead and they can begin to create what will be antiviral drugs. Now, the value of that is very significant, not because it can prevent the virus. Excuse me, it obviously can't do that. But what it can do is it offers a treatment if you get it. It can make the illness dramatically less severe, which means it also dramatically less strains the whole health system. And this, I'm told, can be available, should be available in significant amounts, or at least enough amounts for doctors and hospitals to use in 4 to 6 months. So that's, I mean, keep that in mind, because that'll probably be the second wave. We will go through a period where once what they call as flattening the curve has been achieved, and you have enough people who've also had it where you begin to have some broader immunities in the community, the combination of having a reduced number of people who can be exposed and having a treatment for those who get it will make the second wave dramatically less severe than the first. So we're in still for a rough period. We don't know exactly how long this initial phase is going to take to really see a downturn in terms of numbers of new cases, numbers of deaths. But we do know that, you know, most estimates are by the summer we will be out of that, but we will face, in all likelihood, a second wave in the fall. And I would say that that second wave can be less severe because of what I just mentioned.
Thank you.
Now reported to you what I know from people who actually are working on the vaccine and on the treatment. Now let me go on to what I actually have some expertise on. And the first thing I'd like to say, I want to touch on, before I get to Israel, I want to touch on what's going on in Iran, because undoubtedly you've heard a lot about it. Iran claims to have had about 3,100 cases of coronavirus with 12,000 deaths. The guesstimates are that the numbers afflicting Iran are 4 to 5 times that amount, meaning instead of 3,100 deaths, it's probably on the order of 12 to 15,000 deaths. Instead of 12,000 cases, it's on the order of at least 60,000 cases. This is a result of Iran doing several things from the very beginning that were fundamental mistakes. First of all, they have one of the few countries that has not cut them off is China. China is investing heavily as part of their One Belt, One Road initiative, which is designed to create Chinese infrastructure all around the world in terms of trade that serve China. They're doing a great deal to build the infrastructure within Iran. And so trading with Iran remains a very important issue for the Iranians. Trade with China remains very important. And that has meant that there is a significant Chinese presence in Iran. Now, there was a significant presence within Qom. Qom is basically the religious center of Iran, where all the main seminaries are, where all the main imams are. And when the virus was first being identified within Iran, they did nothing. Some of the religious clerics said, if you simply go to the mosque, that's the treatment that you need. So they were doing exactly the opposite of what needed to be done. And then, of course, the regime, because it puts regime well-being first as opposed to the public's well-being, concealed what was going on, didn't portray the severity of what was happening, didn't, in fact, create any of the kind of quarantines that should have been done, didn't cut off travel to China back and forth for an extended period of time. And so it made this profoundly worse than it had to be. they still, obviously what I've said, the estimates are 4 to 5 times, both in terms of deaths and the number of the cases. They are still not being honest about the scope of what's going on there. Now this deepens what is already profound distrust of the regime. You know, in the aftermath of our killing Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds forces, back on January 3rd, the regime sought to use that initially, and actually with some success, to mobilize a nationalist reaction, a backlash against what we had done. And they did organize, you know, the funeral was a kind of mass dramatic event, but then they shot down the Ukrainian airliner, which was carrying basically all Iranians. There were Ukrainians who were there were dual citizens, some of the best and the brightest, and they misled about that. They lied about that. Finally, they had to reveal they had shot it down. That produced a backlash again within the country against the regime. And so you have a regime that in many ways has lost any basic trust with its own public, has very limited legitimacy, rules on the basis of coercion. It is suffering a decline of 9% even before the coronavirus in terms of its economy. So after it, it's only going to be worse. It is suffering the effects of the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy. So it is reeling economically, and it is reeling in terms of its ability to function, except in one area. It's not reeling in terms of its application of coercion. You know, you're not going to get any mass demonstrations right now because of the virus. The idea that somehow their ability to continue to coerce a society is going to lessen. This is a regime that will do anything to keep itself in power. And one indication that notwithstanding everything that's going on internally right now, everything I just described, they have not changed one iota what they're doing on the outside. By the way, in their own budget, they're giving more money to the Revolutionary Guard, they're giving more money to the Basij militias at a time when the domestic economic needs, the needs of their health system are basically almost impossible to exaggerate. Their priority remains keeping themselves in power. Their priority remains trying to put pressure in a sense, on others in the region. They continue to carry out their counter pressure policy in response to what I call their maximum pressure policy against our maximum pressure policy. And just to give you indications of that, since we killed Soleimani, they have hit, their proxies have hit. When I say their proxies, I mean the Shia militias within Iraq have hit bases where Americans are 15 times, including, you know, in the last a week ago, 3 times. The day before yesterday, President Trump put out a tweet saying we have information that they're planning a sneak attack on our forces if they do it with a terrible response by us. What that indicates is that we probably picked up additional information. They're planning attacks this week. When I say attacks, you know, some are big. When about 10 days ago, they killed we lost 2 American servicemen in one of the attacks. That was an attack where they used 33 rockets and mortars to hit the base. Later in the week, there were much lesser attacks. When I say they, again, these are the Shia militias, not the Iranians directly, but to put this in perspective, it is the Iranians who funds these militias. It is the Iranians who train these militias. It is the Iranians who arm these militias. Frequently, they have with them representatives of the Quds forces of the Revolutionary Guard. So they are an instrument of Iran's policy. What the Iranians are trying to do, and they've created a kind of what's now called there's a kind of new Shia front where they bring all the different militias together. And the Iranians, you just had the head of the Quds forces in Iran in an open way, working with all of the Shia militias. Their aim is to drive the US out of Iraq. This is one of their responses to Soleimani, to show, okay, you killed Soleimani, but we're still in business and we can impose a price on you. This week, you had the Houthis attack Riyadh. with rockets. The Houthis they're seizing one of the more important provinces within Yemen. All this is heating up at the very moment where the Saudis had actually agreed to a negotiating process and have been talking on a daily basis with the Houthis. And suddenly you see the Houthis ratcheting things up. This week, 2 days ago, the Israelis in the midst of the coronavirus at a time when the chief of staff of the IDF, when the prime minister, and when the head of Mossad were all quarantined, the Israelis carried out a strike into Syria against what the Iranians were doing in Syria. And what the Iranians have been trying to do in Syria is not only build up a military infrastructure, they've been trying to create fabrication sites for precision-guided capabilities to put on the rockets that have been provided to Hezbollah and others, both in Syria and in Lebanon. To put this in perspective, Hezbollah has 130,000 rockets in Lebanon. Those rockets don't have precision guidance. They're all inertially driven, meaning they follow a ballistic missile path where they go to a high point, and from that high point, gravity takes them down to a spot. But they have no ability to be targeted with great accuracy. In effect, to describe this most simply, what the Iranians are trying to do is fabricate the equivalent of GPS systems to put on rockets so they have a kind of terminal guidance. Israel really cannot live with that. It's one thing for Hezbollah to have 130,000 rockets that you can describe as dumb rockets. Now, they don't all carry high payloads. They don't all have great range. But let's say that 30,000 of the 130,000 have that. With Iron Dome and with David's Sling, there are two of the anti-missile missiles that the Israelis have. They can discriminate over those rockets that they have to knock down. Those that are going to land in open spaces, they don't have to go after. Radar guides these systems. Now, if it's precision guided, and there's 30,000 rockets, and there's a very limited number of high-value strategic targets, economic and military for Israel, then the systems can be overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. They can be saturated. So Israel doesn't have an option. So here is Iran clearly continuing to pursue that, even in the midst of everything they're suffering on the inside. So it's important to bear in mind what Israel is facing on the outside, even as it continues to confront the coronavirus on the inside. And let me switch to and we can get into more of this if you want.
Sure.
I wanted to at least create a context for our discussion.
Thank you.
Let me switch to Israel. We may be on the brink of a new Israeli government. I just checked before I came on. Just before I came on, Bibi and Benny Gantz were meeting to finalize the terms of the new national unity government. I want to create a little bit of perspective for you here. Gantz is being widely criticized within Israel for agreeing when he didn't need to. And I want to explain the Gantz motivations. He's someone I know. He's being criticized because he had the votes in the Knesset to pass legislation. The very reason that Bibi got the Speaker of the Knesset not to allow the Knesset to meet was to avoid what he feared, which was the ability to pass legislation, because they had the votes. They had 61 votes to pass legislation that would have denied, the legislation would have said anyone who is indicted cannot form a government or run for election. Now, there's only one person who was in that boat right now, and that's Netanyahu. So there was a lot of leverage on him, but the leverage was also limited because Gantz had the 61 votes for legislation, but he didn't have the 61 votes for government. And the reason is there were two members of his party, Blue White, that made it clear that they would not support a government that was installed with the votes of the Arab parties, the Joint List. The Joint List was not going to be part of the government, but they were going to create a parliamentary safety net. They were going to vote to seat this government, even if though they weren't a part of it. Two members of Blue-White were not prepared to be part of a government that was basically installed because of the Israeli Arab votes. We can get further into this as well. Gantz understood, therefore, that on the one hand, he had great leverage on Bibi because he had the votes for the legislation. But on the other hand, he couldn't form a government without Bibi. And the alternative was going to be, if he passed the legislation, from his standpoint, what that was going to do was create even greater bitterness within Israel, because all of the Netanyahu Likud right-wing voters would feel they'd just been disenfranchised. And Bibi, who has, for the last 10 years, still was able to command more votes than anybody else. His party was able to command more votes than anybody else this time. Suddenly, in a sense, take away their vote, and that's certainly the way he would have portrayed it. In fact, he was portraying it that way. Might have not only produced far greater bitterness, I think it would have produced people in the streets. And Gantz made a judgment that whereas one of his partners in Blue-White, Lapid, wanted to pursue the legislation in itself, he was open to it as a tactic to move Bibi on the terms. But he came to see that for Lapid, it wasn't a tactic, it was an end in itself. And he wasn't prepared to do that. This guy who spent his whole life in the military, he used the country as the first thing, and he did something that was very noble. Because he knew the minute he did this, he was going to split his own party. And when he split his own party, he was going to reduce his leverage. I mean, honestly, I do think he agreed too soon, because I think he could have held out longer. But I think he was genuinely motivated by the fact that Israel is suffering an emergency. I was telling Steve that my son, daughter-in-law, and three little grandsons, age 4, 6, and 8, live in a apartment in North Tel Aviv, in Ramat Aviv. And, they are locked down. They're not supposed to go outside except to go to the store or to the pharmacy. They're not supposed to go outside in a small apartment, 3 little boys. I mean, people in Israel are worried just the way people are here, how their livelihood is going to be affected. They're not interested in the political maneuverings. They're interested in having a government that can act. And the problem with the caretaker government, which is what exists right now, is it cannot pass a budget. It can only do what is the equivalent of a continuing resolution. So Gantz made the decision, in a sense, to put the country first, even though the price to him was going to be high. His party split, it reduced his leverage. I can tell you the last issue, he wanted to see in the negotiating, he wanted to see a new health minister, which I don't believe was agreed. The majority of Israelis would like to see a new health minister. The health minister is from the ultra-Orthodox parties. He was very slow to respond to this. He did not respond at all. In fact, actually facilitated at the time of Purim, when there already were edicts on social distancing. He encouraged the Haredi to do the opposite. He allowed ultra-Orthodox and Haredi to come from in New York, where in fact you already had signs of the virus. So there's a real hostility to this, but Bibi is holding out because Bibi needs the religious bloc to support him. He wanted to see a change in the Speaker of the Knesset. There may be, but it's not going to be someone who's going to be independent from Netanyahu. He gave up the foreign ministry. He will be defense minister. He is getting, to be fair, he's getting a number of ministries for his parties that are disproportionate to the actual numbers they now have because of the split of his party. So he may have a kind of veto over a lot that Netanyahu can do. The last issue that was the holdup, Bibi was insisting on going ahead with unilateral annexation, or at least a timeline for unilateral annexation. Gantz was saying we have a national emergency to deal with first. We can deal with that issue later. Gantz's position also was the annexation that would be provided for in the Trump peace plan should not be done unilaterally, but coordinated with Egypt and Jordan, and there should be discussions with the Palestinians. Bibi wanted it as just a strict timetable. I don't know how that issue was resolved. My guess is they finessed it by saying they endorsed the Trump peace plan, and they just sort of fuzzed the issue of the timing of annexation. In the end, I think what Gantz did was noble because he put the country first. And by the way, I'll just conclude with this. That is very consistent with my new book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, Hazak Ve'amatz, because it's a book that's written about what Israel needs to do today and drawing lessons from the past by looking at 4 Israeli leaders, Ben-Gurion, Begin, Rabin, and Sharon, who were very diverse ideologically, but who all viewed the responsibilities of the prime minister and of leadership the same way. Whenever there was a choice, in every one of these cases, whenever there was a choice between what was good for the country and what was good for their political base, they chose the country. That's what Benny Gantz has just done. He chose the country. I'm with what will be a national unity government where Bibi will not be nearly as dependent upon the right, where he'll have blue, white, and he'll also have Amir Peretz is going to come in with a part of labor as well. He will be in a position where he's much less dependent on the right, and we will see a government that focuses on what's most important for the state and not what's most important for a particular political party. So why don't I stop there, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Dennis, as ever, for that terrific tour of the horizon of issues related to Israel and Iran. Apologize for some of the background noise here. I'm having a little trouble with my mute piece here.
Okay.
At any given moment, we have maybe 3 or 4 Zoom meetings going on in our household too. So we appreciate that there are many different voices being heard these days in all sorts of different venues. Let me ask the first question, and then we have a number of questions lined up, Dennis. And that is the issue of whether or not to sustain sanctions on Iran during this time of coronavirus. We saw likely Democratic presidential candidate, nominee, I should say, Joe Biden, oppose sanctions at this moment. Give us your views.
Yes, he didn't oppose sanctions at this moment. He opposed additional sanctions,
Yeah.
and he imposed intensifying the sanctions. What he called for was he did not call for relieving or lifting the sanctions. What he called for is there are pre-existing exceptions to the sanctions for humanitarian provision of humanitarian goods. The Trump administration itself has offered humanitarian assistance to the Iranians, which they've turned down. In fact, the Supreme Leader in his Nowruz New Year's speech said this was probably poison. We shouldn't take it. So we ourselves were offering humanitarian assistance because there is an exception to the sanctions for humanitarian assistance. What Biden was calling for was creating 2 things. Right now there are companies and banks that won't finance or provide the humanitarian assistance because they fear they will be subjected to secondary sanctions by the United States. There is not a lot of clarity about the risks you run if you go ahead and you're acting with the Iranians, and in some cases they're paying for this. The mechanisms for paying for it have to be clear enough that they're not then subjected, those who receive the money aren't then subjected to a sanction. So what Biden was calling for was A, clarify that, B, create special channels so that everyone knows these channels, these are vehicles that are safe to use to provide humanitarian assistance. That's what Biden was calling for. That, by the way, is very much my view. I don't believe any sanctions should be lifted at this point. I know the Iranians are trying to use this as a lever to get sanctions lifted, but we shouldn't lift the sanctions, but we also shouldn't make it harder for humanitarian assistance to be delivered. We should be highlighting, in a sense, we're going to great lengths to be sure the Iranian people are receiving this at a time when we know the Iranian leadership is not putting the Iranian public first.
Thank you. Dennis, a question about the role of the Mossad in assisting Israel, particularly procuring necessary medicines and personal protective equipment for physicians and medical personnel at this time. It seems as though the Prime Minister deployed Mossad.
He's deploying Shin Bet more than Mossad. Mossad is
Okay.
focused on the outside. Shin Bet is focused on the inside. What they've done. Shin Bet was authorized, in a sense, to track people's cell phones. Those who were identified with having the virus, or those who were tested positively, they were to be tracked, and anyone they came in contact with was to be tracked. So obviously, one of the things that we as a public tend to underestimate is how easy it is to basically intrude on our private lives now. Our cell phones, our iPads, our computers should be seen as broadcasting mechanisms. They broadcast everything about us. You know, you buy theater tickets, they know what you like. You order food, they know what food you like. You order clothes, they know what clothes you like. You know, you go anywhere, they know where you are. They have the ability to track this. Now, the Israelis, just as we, have civil liberty protections that are designed to prevent that from happening, from that power being misused, that kind of surveillance capability. What Bibi did is he authorized Shin Bet to do this. That produced an outcry, because the view within the Knesset was that, okay, you can do this, but there has to be oversight, so that this doesn't run amok and this doesn't, in a sense, trample on our civil liberties. In general right now, especially given the way the Haredi community has behaved in Israel, there is a need to know everyone who's seen, anybody who has been infected, anybody who might be carrying the virus. You know, we know how easy it is to transmit this. I should say, by the way, again, this is not my expertise, but I'm a good reporter. What I know from our epidemiologists is that you need a kind of intense 15, 30 minutes of exposure to somebody who has it. And even then, you know, it's a droplet you have to somehow touch your nose, your eyes, or your mouth. The reason so many doctors got this was they were treating patients before they knew what they had. Number one, they were treating them for up to 30 minutes. They were heavily exposed. They were touching them and checking them out. You know, they were checking their nose and their throats. And they didn't have protective gear at the time, which is why the numbers of medical personnel who've gotten it is so high, and why the problems in New York are so severe. Again, partly because of that, and partly because they didn't have the protective gear really enough, but also because their exposure was intense. And it requires an intense exposure to get this. That's why social distancing, if it's actually done, is quite effective. Again, end of my non-expertise.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate all the background you're providing. To the extent that you know, how is Lebanon and Hezbollah dealing with COVID-19? And perhaps we can even add Hamas and Gaza to that question.
Yeah, so what's interesting, let me start just by saying what's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the West Bank. There really is extraordinary cooperation there, something that we've never seen before. First of all, the Israelis allowed Palestinian workers to stay in Israel. You know, the workers come in, they have like a nightly, they go back and forth. They allowed them to stay in Israel to continue working for a certain period of time until more of the society got shut down. Ironically, because a lot of them actually do some essential work. But so that has never been done before, number one. Number two, the Israelis allowed the Palestinian security forces to come into the areas, not of municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, but what's known as the Area B villages that are right next to Jerusalem that have never been, actually they're Area B and C. These are areas that they've never been allowed to come into, villages that are like Abu Dis, Abu Tor, Isawiya. These are basically suburbs of Jerusalem that they've never been allowed to be part of, but the Israelis allow them to come in. The health ministries are working very closely together. So the cooperation there is pretty remarkable, and I would say very practical. The cooperation in Gaza is more problematic, but it's still going on because the Israelis are allowing a lot of material to go in. And Hamas agreed. The Israelis were allowing, right before this, the Israelis were allowing up to 7,000 Palestinians a day to come into Israel to work from Gaza. And the reason for that is because as I was down there in January, and I went to the crossing point. I was there with the commander who runs all of this. And he was saying to me, look, we deal with them all the time. What we hear from the Palestinians who come through is every time we allow a Palestinian worker in, that's basically feeding a family of 10. And the more who have a stake in preserving their jobs, the more you create a potential for stability. You reduce Hamas's incentive to cause trouble, because Hamas itself realizes it's got to manage the situation. Now here, Hamas has agreed that there shouldn't be workers going into Israel, notwithstanding the economic consequences of it, because they realize the irony about Gaza, it's totally closed off, right? Everybody focuses on Israel, but it's also Egypt that keeps it closed off. But because it's closed off, because they can't travel, they don't have exposure. So, you know, they have almost no cases of the virus right now because they don't have exposure. The only exposure is in Israel. So there is a kind of interesting cooperation there, but there is real fear, and I underscore the word fear, in the Israeli security apparatus, because the poverty within Gaza, the close living quarters within Gaza, the population density within Gaza mean that if you began the virus and the very limited medical capabilities in Gaza mean that this would be highly problematic. And there's a worry that if they got it and it became epidemic there, that they all, you know, you might have tens of thousands of people coming up to the barrier with Israel, trying to break into Israel. And what's Israel supposed to do? Let in tens of thousands of people? Maybe, you know, this is an area, a very finite area of 2 million people. You can see something quite catastrophic. So the Israelis have an interest in getting as much material, medical material, into Gaza, testing and masks as is possible, and having the international community also be there. Now, Hezbollah has reduced its focus in Syria right now to contend with what's going on in Lebanon. And it's, you know, it's pretty much a disaster there too. And again, for some of the same reasons. First of all, one of the reasons there's a reduced Hezbollah presence in Syria right now is because they want to be less exposed to the Iranians who carry the virus from Iran there. You know, here is the Syrian regime dependent on the Iranians. And so what you have is, at this point, the Iranians are carriers of this. So you have, for the time being, and I wouldn't exaggerate the duration of this, but you have, for the time being, a preoccupation within Lebanon, trying to cope with what is there also a financial meltdown on the one hand, and the rapid spread of the virus on the other. So Hezbollah is dealing with both. The focus is not geared towards the Israelis. That makes it quite ironic that Israel felt the need to carry out a strike this week in the Aleppo area, which means that it's the Quds forces that was bringing in probably component parts for fabricating precision-guided capabilities for the rockets. That's probably the one thing that would have led to a strike this week by the Israelis.
Dennis, here's a unified field theory question for you in the sense that connects Minnesota company and Israel and coronavirus. Here's a recent headline. Ventilator manufacturer Medtronic gives away patents to its competitors. This week, the CEO of the company's Israel division, Yaron Yitzhari, made the decision to release all of Medtronic's patents for the production of ventilators in order to enable companies to manufacture ventilators, which is what they do, and enable the other companies to assist. You know, our JCRC legislator trips to Israel, we always visit Medtronic Israel as to demonstrate the economic relationship between Israel and Medtronic. So here it is, and that's mostly just a question inviting your commentary.
Look, one of the things that I think that is underappreciated in this country is just what a startup nation Israel really is, and how cutting edge it is across the board, and how much we gain from that. We as a country gain from that. Companies in this country that partner with Israeli companies. It's pretty remarkable, and it's a reminder of what Israel has developed in a circumstance where, notwithstanding what I was saying earlier, it's maintained its civil liberties in the face of constant threats, and it's become, you know, a country whose technologies are sought everywhere, by the way, including in the Arab world. Just to give you an interesting little fact that none of you are probably aware of, there are 500 Israeli companies that are working in the Gulf, okay, the Arabian Peninsula. Now, yes, it's true, they're not working there with their Israeli passports, but every one of these Israeli companies, they know the people know who they're working with. They're highly sought after. And this is what will, over time, change the face of the Middle East.
Thank you, Dennis. A question about annexation.
Yeah.
What would be the fallout of annexation? I know it's a remarkably complicated issue, and it's, of course, at the heart of the discussions between Benny Gantz and Prime Minister Netanyahu. But give us some of your thoughts about annexation, where it could lead, what might happen, you know, perspective of this administration, a potential Democratic administration. I know it's a broad question, but it, of course, weighs heavily on Middle East negotiation.
Look, I think unilateral annexation is one thing. Annexation that is part of an understanding, even if it's not a formal agreement, is something else. The division between Netanyahu and Gantz was Bibi wants to go ahead and annex the areas that are provided to Israel in the Trump plan, which would be a little over 30% of the West Bank, which would include 77 settlements in the West Bank. I'm talking about outside the settlement blocks. I should include all, because all the areas, so it's 128 settlements. The Trump plan would permit all 128 settlements to be annexed to Israel. The Trump plan would also have the Jordan Valley annexed to Israel. If you annex the Jordan Valley, you put the peace treaty with Jordan at risk. Now, whether Jordan would actually withdraw from the peace treaty, I doubt that they'll withdraw from the peace treaty, but I think they will suspend it. The king will be forced to do something that is highly symbolic and dramatic. He can't do nothing in the face of that. One of the problems with the Trump plan is that it addresses only Israeli needs and no one else's needs. And it doesn't, you know, when you're trying to work out something, you should approach it from the standpoint of practical needs and political needs. Practically, Israel needs to control the Jordan Valley. That's a fact. And the truth is, if you really talk to Jordanian and the king in private, he would admit that. What you can't have is Israel, that this becoming sovereign Israeli territory. When I was doing the back channel negotiations, even after I left the Obama administration, we came up with the idea of a 99-year lease to Israel of a strip all along the Jordan River. And we were going to counterbalance that by having leases for Palestinians and a part of Ashdod for the port, part of Ben Gurion, and an area next to Haifa for a desalinization plant. So practically you meet the need of the Palestinians, and I would even say the Jordanians, that the Israelis don't now take this territory and make it theirs. But you meet their symbolic need, you meet the Israeli practical need of controlling it. That wasn't done here. So Bibi wants to take advantage of the Trump plan and go ahead and annex. Gantz supports the Trump plan, but says we should coordinate with the Egyptians, Jordanians, and even talk to the Palestinians, we shouldn't unilaterally implement annexation. That's when I drew this distinction between annexation. It depends on the context of annexation. You know, the concept of settlement blocks and swaps was one I developed in the year 2000. What did that mean? It meant that Israel would annex into Israel the settlement blocks that are basically at about 5 or 6% of the West Bank closest to the Green Line. But in return, there would be territorial swaps and compensation. By the way, the Trump plan provides for swaps, but it breaks up the West Bank in a way that makes it pretty hard to say this looks like a state. And the point is, annexation, how you annex will affect what the consequences are. Do it as part of a formal understanding, you do it as part of an informal understanding that's coordinated, then you're not going to have a political fallout. You do it unilaterally, you're going to have a political fallout. And I would say, I never believed that when the president made his decision on Jerusalem that would trigger anything from the Palestinian. Because as long as he wasn't formally saying that the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock were going to be Israel's, that would be the only thing that would trigger violence. And so there was no violence in response to our declaration on Jerusalem. But if you go ahead and you unilaterally annex, think that anyone who says they know what's going to happen in terms of on the street, they don't know. So I think the point here is, and I think one of the arguments that was probably being made internally with Bibi was, do you really need to open another front right now with everything we got going on? And my bet is that the military was probably also weighing in on that and saying, we don't need this right now. So we'll see what worked out. But my answer to your question is, annexation is going to be very problematic if it's done unilaterally. There are ways, as I said, to change the context. There even are ways ultimately to do it unilaterally, but to have given the Palestinians a chance. And I don't mean by right now. Look, Trump said they have a 4-year window. If they have a 4-year window, then and that they can make a counteroffer, then why not give them the 4-year window? Why not say, okay, at the end of 4 years, if you haven't done anything, there will be annexation. But don't do it now. Then you preempt anything and you run a real risk.
Dennis, there was a report from from your institute, about Palestinian views towards a two-state solution, which found significant, if not majority, opposition to a two-state solution. But at the same time, a certain, maybe perhaps different or realistic view in the Palestinian community that there wasn't support for negation of a relationship with Israel, either in relatively small support for two states, for a one-state unified solution, and also fairly significant plurality in support of more or less maintaining the status quo, and a significant numbers also Palestinians who want to remain as a part of the state of Israel. Makes sense of these various responses in the Palestinian polity, is to the extent you can.
I will, to the extent I can. First of all, it's always possible for people to hold contradictory views. And I think that explains this. I think the main reason you've seen a loss of support for two states among Palestinians is that they believe it's never going to happen. So why emotionally invest in something? Among Palestinians under the age of 30, the vast majority of them say, let the Israelis stay where they are, just give us the vote. They say, fine, Israel works, we'll work in it, but give us the vote. That becomes one state for two people. That's actually the reason, that's the main reason for the new book, to explain that's where Israel's headed, unless you have a leader who's prepared to make some tough decisions. I think with the Palestinians, what you have going on is a loss of any hope or faith and even the possibility of two states, number one. Number two, they have no faith in their own leadership. They're completely alienated from their own leadership. And that contributes to some of this. Number three, I think, what they most are concerned about right now is their economic well-being. Even before the coronavirus, that's what they were most concerned about, their economic well-being. And so if you could show that a two-state outcome was a realistic possibility, the numbers you have would change on the Palestinian side. You can almost track this. Their decline in support for two states has paralleled the growth in the disbelief that anything can happen. And Steve, you've heard me speak for a long time about the biggest problem is disbelief on both sides. So support for two states that used to exist on both sides is not what it used to be on the Israeli side as well. And mostly that's the function, neither side believes it's ever going to happen.
Dennis, as ever, you've been a wonderful interlocutor and host, and we're looking forward to your visit back to the Twin Cities in healthier times and better times when we can hear more about your book and you can expand upon these thesis statements that you're making in front of a variety of audiences. But I always believe, and we started at this note, you gave us a glimpse of hope with respect to, and I appreciate the fact that you're not an expert on necessarily vaccines versus treatment, but overall in the Middle East and in Israel, perhaps you can just give us a word of hope as we conclude before Shabbat here.
Yeah, look, I'll tell you, I would cite two things that can give you some hope in what is otherwise a pretty bleak circumstance. All of us should have been reminded by the fact that we are part of one human race. And when you have a pathogen like what we're facing now, it doesn't respect borders. And so one can hope that some of the lessons from this are learned about, we all have our national identity, but we also have borders that are meaningless when we face climate change or we face pathogens. So I cite that because what I was mentioning before about the Israelis and the Palestinians in the West Bank, the level of cooperation there has been quite striking. And one other interesting point I should add, normally the standing of the Palestinian security forces is very low among the Palestinian public because too often they see them as being kind of an instrument of Israeli control. But in the Palestinian polling, support for the Palestinian security forces has shot up because they see them somehow acting in a practical way. And so the combination of working together and the Palestinian security forces, I view that as something somewhat hopeful. Secondly, it's a larger issue. I touched on it when I said 500 Israeli companies are working in the Gulf. There's a deeper reality that exists where the Sunni Arab leaderships all collectively see Israel as the main bulwark against the threats they face, whether it's Iran, the Shia militias, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and they trust Israel more than they trust the United States. And that's become even more pronounced during the Trump period. So that's not going to change anytime soon. And that creates, there's an undercurrent already of cooperation below the radar screen. The point here is that, this creates a strategic basis for doing more within the region itself over time. And again, I think if we had a more effective diplomatic administration, and I mean an administration that was more effective diplomatically, I think we could have taken more advantage of that in the efforts to actually help between Israelis and Palestinians, not because the Arab states are going to tell the Palestinians what to do, but because we could have gotten the Arab states to actually embrace, at least in the sense of saying it's serious, the Trump plan, had it been serious, when I come to Minneapolis, I can talk more about this. Had the Trump plan been more credible, been more serious, I believe that we could have gotten the major Sunni Arab leaders to say it was a serious basis for negotiations. And if we could have gotten that from them, we could have gotten European leaders to say the same thing because they will not be more Arab than the Arabs. And the Palestinians, the one way to change the Palestinian approach, which is always to say no when there's an opportunity, the old Abba Eban line, they never miss an opportunity. The one way to change Palestinian attitudes, at least the leadership's attitudes, not the public. I think the public in some ways is far more practical than the leadership. The one way to get them to change is to realize that they're going to be isolated. when you deal with the Palestinians, you have to find a way to politically isolate them. Because of where the Arabs are, there was a potential for that. I think, unfortunately, we squandered that potential, but it doesn't mean it's gone forever. And I do think the potential over time to improve things in the region exists. And ironically, it's a function of the threats that are seen, that have drawn Sunni Arab leaderships in Israel together.
Thank you, Dennis. First of all, I wish you and Debbie and the entire family good health, stay safe. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. As I noted before, we welcome your return in the fall to the Twin Cities, and we'll hear more about your book. To everyone who participated, thank you very much. Shabbat Shalom, and wishing everybody a Ramadan Mubarak and a blessed Easter and a joyful Pesach in the days and weeks to come. JCRC is always here to help. We're pleased that we've been able to conduct 2 of our living room webinars this week, Neil Kashkari yesterday, today with Dennis Ross, 2 outstanding experts in their respective fields. So we thank everyone for participating. Thank you to the JCRC board, to our executive committee, to our board chair, Marty Chester, and all those who make our work possible. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful weekend to the extent possible under the circumstances. And thank you for joining us virtually, drawing us closer virtually, but of course, maintaining social distance at this time. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you.